Hello, my name is Richard Wentworth. I'm an artist, and I've come here today to talk to Ivor Bowditch, who, from meeting him once before, I think might be the person who knows most about China clay in the world. I say that with a little bit of humour, but the point of talking to Ivor is to find out what he knows, and I'm incredibly curious about the entire subject. And I remember when we spoke once before, you describing how you grew up, and I still feel that that's incredibly important. And did it have something to do with farming?
Yes, in fact, I'm a Shropshire lad, and we holidayed in Cornwall, and I was always fascinated by the landscape in and around St Austell, which was described, and still is to some extent, as a lunar landscape. And China clay generates quite large volumes of waste materials, many of which today are used, for example, sand and gravel. But the tips were cone-shaped, and it gave this impression, particularly from a distance, of being a lunar landscape. China clay, of course, is used in a wide variety of end uses. At that time, paper was the major consumer, but of course ceramics is something that everyone would recognise, but paints, rubbers, plastics, sealants, adhesives. And I joined when the company was moving from 1 million tonnes to 2 million tonnes to 3 million tonnes annual output. And so I found myself, almost by chance, because the company were desperate for young supervisors, at the age of 20, managing a shift as a shift supervisor with 51 people in the shift, most of whom were old enough to be my father. So it was quite an experience.
Were you welcomed?
I hope I was. I would say yes, because all that I was able to pass on in later life about the industry and its peculiarities was largely taught by these elder gentlemen, as I thought them to be, but really lads in their 40s and 50s. And I listened, and of the 51 that I had in those early days managing a shift, I only had one guy who tried to wrong-do me, and he came to work with too much beer aboard on a night shift. And I went down to question him, and I asked him to walk towards me. And I moved left and I moved right, and I could see he wasn't walking straight, and he fell over.
What year was that?
That would have been in 1970. And those experiences really sort of set me up for life, because I went on to work, not on the production side for the whole of my career, but I spent some time in marketing and human resources, and ended up as the communications manager, which was a job I thoroughly enjoyed. I travelled quite widely, but for my love of Cornwall, I say thank God I always had a Cornish base.
Can you go back, almost do me a sort of geological story? I mean, when does China clay, tell us what China clay is, and at what point it starts to become a player?
Yeah, I mean, China clay in very simple terms is decomposed granite, and granite consists of three minerals: quartz, feldspar and mica. And it's the feldspar content in the granite which basically is altered, and largely due to acidic vapours or the presence of water, which can be acidic, and heat. And in Cornwall and Devon, where the granites were at one time under the sea, certain geological features took place which really, I suppose, you would liken to volcanic activity. And radioactive gases were produced, very acidic, and the end result was that the feldspar became softened, and of course had these extra special properties which were discovered in the 18th century, which allowed the feldspar to be turned into porcelain.
And the feldspar, are they the little flecks in
It
the...
would be the white portion of a lump of granite.
Yeah.
The silver greys, the quartz, and the darker coloured material, almost black in colour, is the mica. And we, of course, even today have huge quantities of waste which we have to discard. But I'm very pleased to say that over the last 25 to 30 years, that more and more of the sand and gravel are now used in the local construction market. And we even see a weekly train leaving Cornwall to go up to some ready-mix plants in the Greater London area.
Go back into the 18th century, which I always think one has to say the 1700s, but I'm that kind of child. Who found what, when, how?
Well, the person who found clay was himself a chemist, a Plymouth chemist. He was a Quaker and had Quaker friends living in Cornwall who were involved in mine management, copper and tin mine management. And William Cookworthy, the Plymouth chemist, had come down to see a friend, fellow Quaker, who was in charge of a mine fairly close to Helston, really between Helston and Penzance, an area, small area of granite known as Tregonning Hill. And he saw that they were using the early steam engines in the mines, and they were repairing the fireboxes of the engines with clay that was being actually produced almost as a byproduct from tin mining. And he
So almost like a
recognised
kiln.
he recognised the properties, and the rest is history, as they say. No, these fireboxes were on basically raising steam for the steam engines, which were used for pumping and then for winding.
So are you describing bricks? I mean, what form is the clay in?
Or the clay was made into a brick, like a fire brick.
Yes.
But Cookworthy, who had certainly done his homework, had seen Chinese porcelain traded through Plymouth, and being a chemist had been able to deduce really what was going on and how this clay could be fashioned. And he, in fact, took out a patent some years after he made the discovery, which was in 1746. He took out a patent in 1768, which basically gave him the right and his partner to produce what he would describe as English porcelain. Now this infuriated the established potters up in Staffordshire, so you then had such established names as Wedgwood, Spode and Minton, all challenging the patent, and it was in fact modified in 1775, and that opened up a period of activity when the Staffordshire potters came down to Cornwall and actually operated some clay workings on their own account.
So they came on site?
They came on site.
Yeah.
But of course we didn't have a link really with England, as the Cornish would describe, until we saw the railway. I mean, obviously you could travel by road, but it was very lengthy travel-wise. But when the Royal Albert Bridge was constructed at Saltash
And the date of
by
that
Brunel, 1859, we then saw clay starting to be moved to Stoke-on-Trent by rail, and the Staffordshire potters by this time had really thought of relinquishing their operations and left them in the capable hands of Cornish managers. So some of the potters continued to actually own the holdings, but left the day-to-day management to local Cornishmen. And by the beginning of the 20th century, there were almost 100 companies. I mean, today there is just really one major producer worldwide of china clay, a company called Imeris, who eventually took over the company that I joined in the 1960s, a company called English China Clays.
It's very unusual that somebody would have childlike curiosity and it would lead to 50 years in a business.
Yeah. I think the other thing...
It's charming. I mean, it's...
I'm, very proud of, and my dear Cornish friends, I quickly, although I didn't have a particular West Midlands accent, I recognised the wonderful Cornish dialect, and if you didn't learn to understand the dialect quickly, you were not going to be particularly well thought of. So by the age of 20, having spent 3 years then in the industry, I was told, "You're one of we now, boy, you're one of we." So
You'll have to translate that.
I had reached a point where I could understand all the dialect expressions, so they accepted me as a Cornish man, a Cornish cousin, although born actually in Shropshire.
And what you just said?
One of we. Well, one of we. You're one of us.
That's very nice.
There were already problems looming with regard to criticism of the way the landscape was being treated.
And who would those critics be?
And they would normally be people who had no knowledge of mining or quarrying, who probably, to a great extent, were very often professional people, teaching, accountancy, languages, who would come along to Cornwall and see not only a landscape which was very vastly different to anything they would see anywhere else in the country. The nearest would be probably the slag heaps surrounding deep coal mines. Ours was so noticeable, being white, and we also, in fact, quite legitimately at one time had a free hand in being able to turn certain residues, which were fine in particle size, into the rivers. So the river fowl, the St Austell River and the Par River, all basically having their source within the 25 square miles of clay-bearing granite. Those three rivers carried the mica, which there is little value or use for, and they went white over a period of probably 50 years, starting from the middle of the 19th century. And that continued at a pace, really, throughout the 20th century. So much so that the St Austell River, even to this day, is referred to as the White River, and the new town centre, built some 25 years ago in St Austell, is known as White River Place. People very often would write off mining as being a fairly crude undertaking, brute force and ignorance. But China clay required quite a lot of sophistication, and ECC really excelled at research and development. And we developed many techniques for refining not only China clay but many other minerals, and at peak employed 250 people in a central laboratory in St Austell, which serviced our interests, which started to grow into other minerals as well as China clay.
So that laboratory was highly speculative?
Highly speculative, and also highly influential on us really putting a whole range of new products into the marketplace, into markets which at the beginning of the 20th century weren't even known, like plastics, as a good example.
As a filler in plastics?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we not only had this responsibility to try and make sure we could do the best we could with the raw materials that we were dealing with, but I think that there was more than a degree of real understanding that the environment was important. We went to one university in particular who were doing a lot of work with the coal mining industry on reshaping and vegetating coal tips. And we worked with Liverpool University, and by the early 1970s had formed a specialist landscaping unit and we've been responsible for literally, it runs now into thousands of acres of ground have been restored, and a lot of the areas in mid-Cornwall now, if you could bring someone back who knew it, say, 50 years ago, they wouldn't recognise what they see today.
Was that provoked by Aberfan, or does that proceed?
It started before Aberfan, but Aberfan, I mean, again, it showed the kindred spirit between those of us who basically were involved in mineral extraction in one form or another. And I remember the collection boxes going around the mess rooms, or we call them crib huts. You have crib in mid-Cornwall, that's your meal break, and you have Croust in West Cornwall, just to confuse you. But we
Crib and Croust.
Crib and Croust.
Okay, I'll remember
but
that.
in mid-Cornwall, this crib time boy, and you had a 20-minute break for basically a cup of tea at 9:30, and you had a 40-minute break, so you had your hour off during the day, so you had a 40-minute break for lunch. And we had at our crib break at the 9:30, the senior captain, again a mining term found in both metal mining and china clay, the captain brought round a small tin labelled up for Aberfan, and we felt it. It was a kindred spirit.
Yeah.
I've met a lot of politicians through my job in communications, and some I have been impressed with, and others I've been very disappointed with, on both sides of the political fence as well. And I've seen local politicians who appear at times not to look at the broader picture, and I think it's easy in a county like Cornwall to always be championing the tourist industry as an example, or the hospitality trade is a word which springs to mind these days. And you messy old people digging holes in the ground, what do you want to do that for? There is a time and a place for everything, but I do feel at times that the broader picture is not examined, and we do so at our peril. You would find that people have been inspired by, and I think it is still fairly unique in Cornwall these days, a real Cornishness, which you wouldn't find certainly in Falmouth or St Ives or Bude. But if you go to the villages which have grown up around the clay industry, like Nanpian or Bugle, St Stephen, you'll find the dialect still exists, the dialect expressions, the sense of being together as a community, hence why we still have, I think, more than our fair share of brass bands in mid-Cornwall. And of course we've had some great choirs. The Trevisco choir was probably the greatest, but that was a very long time ago when they beat the Welsh at their own game at the National Night at Stetford in Llangollen.
But the moment you started talking about the bands, so there's no, we can't hear them, but I immediately felt emotional. And that's obviously one of those why culture is so strange, because it's a 4-letter word, band, brass, another 5 letters. It's very, very strong when you invoke things like that. Maybe this is a very sort of easy sort of gender joke, but little boys dig holes in gardens, and most little boys have probably done something very stupid where they've probably buried a sister. Something's fallen in.
Yeah.
So that the whole culture of digging is which I'm really interested that when you disturb the ground. So you probably, laughably, we might call that gardening. Anything to do with tilling. And that doesn't take very long before that becomes mining. So the relationship of mining to canal making, for instance. And then you've got these people all over these islands who were specialists. I suppose in one sense they end up as the navigators. But is there a way in which the different groups of miners would move around? I mean,
well, the Cornish, of course, were infamous for their global movements, and there's an expression which I heard as a teenager: wherever you find a hole in the ground, boy, there'll be a Cornishman there. And that's true to a great extent. If not born and bred in Cornwall, probably someone who is trained at the, I think, internationally famous Camborne School of Mines, now of course part of Exeter University. And I did some of my early training, I did a diploma in mining on a part-time, and the old sort of, you did a week here and a week there, but I attended Camborne School of Mines, and there is a kinship that people who work in mining have a commonality and a liking for each other. On my father's side of the family, the Bowditch name, which is strange, some people think it's Eastern European, but it's actually a Dorset name. And most of the Bowditches are either in Dorset or East Devon. But my grandfather and his two older brothers had moved to Wales deliberately because land was cheap, and they bought land in the Sahawi Valley between Tredegar and Blackwood. And they actually, they found coal on the farm as well. And so my mother said, this is where you got your mining streak from. Because
when you say they found coal on the farm, say a bit more.
Well, they were basically farming sheep, and of course Wales is very well known for sheep farming. And the sheep, it was quite steep land, were digging around. And my grandpa told me he'd picked up a Welsh accent. Good, you know, Grandad found coal right in the side of the valley there. And I've got some trade books written in the early 20th century, one in 1910, when Bowditch brothers, the three brothers, were employing 95 people in a drift mine. These weren't shaft mines, they were just going into the side of the hill. Yeah. So and my grandfather continued in a technical role until his retirement, which was in the mid-50s. So I suppose I could say that the drive towards holes in the ground started with grandfather.
Yeah, and you went from black to white.
And I went from black to white, yeah.
Can you describe that for a child, how you getting the water out of the clay?
Well, getting the water out of the clay is that
draining
in the sort of end of the refining stage, the clay would look in a glass rather like a tumbler full of milk.
Yep.
And if you give it a few days to settle, it will go to the consistency of a single cream, and it will stay roughly like that. But if you left it for,
in suspension,
yeah, for months and months, it would eventually it would settle, and it would become more like clotted cream, and you'd have water on the top.
But you don't have months and months.
No, we don't have months and months.
So what is the accelerant?
The accelerant is firstly filtration. So you put the clay basically into a chamber where the particles of clay will bridge the gap in a nylon filter cloth, but the water will pass through.
Okay.
And so you take the bulk of the water out by letting the water pass through the filter and retaining the solids. And then because you've still got roughly 25-30% water left in what is a bit like putty, you normally convert that into small lumps, rather like noodles,
Yeah.
through an extruder and put it
Okay.
into a thermal dryer. And
So you end up literally heating,
We would use
cooking it.
natural gas to dry the clay, yeah.
Wow.
In 1955, when the industry produced its first 1 million tonnes annually, 70% of the clay in 1955 is dried on coal-fired kilns. And if you go around the St Austell area, you'll find many examples of the old kilns, easily picked out by the chimney stack.
Yeah.
Now the chimney stack was at obviously the smoke discharge end, and at the other end would have been the fireplaces, either 2 or 3, and connecting to the chimney were a series of brick flues covered with a tile. In fact, there's a tile right behind your chair there. So you would have
Oh my God, yeah.
a couple of thousand tiles on the floor, and you let the clay go in there at about the consistency of clotted cream, which had already been settling in a tank.
Right.
Spread it out, flatten it, and at the fire end it would dry.
So you push it
yeah,
out.
and you had typical length of the kiln would be 250 feet, and the width would be normally about 16 feet.
Men in Wellington boots?
Men in Wellington boots.
Yeah.
And at the kiln
And a tool, a
fire
spreader
end,
tool, or
they would be shoveling it off at the end of a 8-hour shift, and at the stack end once a week, because it took much longer. It was cooler.
so a
at the
linear,
stack end.
yes,
Yeah.
a beginning and an end.
A beginning and an
Yeah.
end, yeah.
I think the word landscape is quite pretty contested. And I actually heard somebody on a mobile phone recently saying, I can't talk now, I'm in the countryside. And of course I had to not laugh. But these terms which we have for place, and place being productive, which often means that in some people's mind that the place is then damaged. So we're talking about a landscape which has been, ferociously visited. Could you say a bit about its reshaping and the values that are involved in reshaping it?
Yes, I think as I mentioned earlier, the company was certainly aware, probably ahead of the game, of the increasing pressures that would be coming the way of quarry and mine operators. And because the landscape was so dramatic, as I described it, and known to many people, the lunar landscape, the sand tips which dominated the St Austell area were all conical. So you had these white cones literally sitting. I mean, there were dozens of them all over the 25 square miles.
Was that a natural batter they came to?
It was the natural angle of repose that the sand would
Yeah,
fall
wow.
at. And when we started looking very seriously at landscaping at the end of the 60s, and with the work we did on the vegetating of landscapes, which was largely with, as mentioned, Liverpool University, we looked at the natural profile of the landscape before we'd been mining. And the 25 square miles was made up of some high moorland, the highest point being Hensbarrow Beacon, and it was a beacon point when beacons were used for signalling, and that's just over 1,000 feet above sea level. And sort of either side of the beacon, you had these river valleys, and I've mentioned the rivers known as the White Rivers. They were all in valleys. So you then had rolling countryside leading up to the high point on Hensbarrow Beacon. So the landscaping has generally followed one of trying to create a more rolling landscape. Initially, the conical tips were basically decapitated. We took the top off them, and we started running the spoil out with conveyors. All the cone-shaped tips involved inclines, a standard railway, with 2 wagons, one going up loaded, one coming down, counterbalance. Yeah. And you produce very steep angles of well over 30 degrees. And the way in which we started landscaping, first of all, was to flatten, so the tops of the tip were perfectly flat, And
And what would the diameter of a typical decapitated cone be?
Probably somewhere in the order of up to 500 feet. Yeah.
That's a lot of stuff.
And the one cone which still remains very visible is just above St Austell, and that contains almost 1 million tons of sand. And you know, when you start to think of what 1 million tons of sand would look like, we'll go and look at that cone. But the area has changed dramatically. It's a very good vantage point to look. You can look down on St Austell Bay and see Parr and Charlestown, where clay used to be shipped from. Again, sadly, no longer.
Clay went out of Charlestown?
Yes,
Really?
until 1999.
But not out of the little cutting, out of a...
Yes.
No way.
Yeah. It was carried down by road.
Is that what the chute is for?
And that's what the chutes are for. And on a windy day, you certainly knew they were loading clay. There's a white cloud hanging over you in Charlestown. And of course clay was also shipped out of Pentuan and many other Cornish ports, including Newquay and Wadebridge.
So is that why Charlestown was widened in 1970? I was there yesterday. So
yes, yeah.
So
they could get
a bigger
vessel in. Yeah. The maximum we could ever carry in Charlestown was about 1,000 tons, and that was only with boat design becoming more flexible for manoeuvring. But the average throughout its 20th century life, second half of 20th century life, after World War II, would have been about 400 tons going in there. But the landscape has, as I say, naturally taken on much more gentle slopes, and wherever vegetation is possible, if it's typical moorland, it will be moorland. If we can get away with pasture, it'll be pasture. And there's been a huge program of tree planting, probably somewhere in the order of 100,000 trees.
In a way, one of the things that's come out of talking with you is I realise that there's a really strong feeling of comings and goings, people who come into Cornwall for whatever reason and leave. All this material that has to be moved, boats arriving to take stuff away, boats with crews. Can you say something about the moment where all these people meet these other people? So you've got the Cornishmen and their product, the little ports, boats coming.
Yes, I mean, I would say it could lead to amusements and lead to friction. But on the whole, the ports of Foy, Parr and Charlestown all enjoyed quite regular visits by many of the crews, so they got to know the area, and we've even had some marriages which have sprung from those relationships of visiting seamen. And we had a period which was quite interesting when a lot of Russian vessels, particularly larger vessels going into Foy, they also had a lucrative trade in collecting old cars, and some hair-raising experiences of these cars being driven onto the deck of ships to be deck cargo.
Are we in the 1990s?
This is in the 1980s.
1980s?
Yeah.
Let's say the implication